So I kind of want to just come on here and talk about metacognition because it's a really good tool for mindfulness, for your inner peace, for realizing your thoughts are not your thoughts, so on and so forth. So what exactly is metacognition? Metacognition is the awareness of your inner landscape. And that's just like an approximate um, definition. So imagine you are seeing with your eyes, well, not with your eyes, but with your mind, like what's going on within your mind. You're aware of it as the observer. So let's call this I, which is just a metaphor for your pure consciousness. So you're just pure awareness, or the observer, right? And essentially, you're seeing what's going on in your inner landscape. Let's use this color, like. And you're observing this as the awareness or observer. This act in itself is simply called metacognition, where you're seeing what's going on within your mind, within your mental plane. So let's call this realm the mental plane. Or you can call it your inner world, your mind, or simply just your thoughts, or where your thoughts take place. And so this can be really good for inner peace because the awareness or being the observer, right? You're kind of separate from what's happening within. So, for example, the things that can happen within are your worries, your negative thoughts, your, let's say, your worries or negative thoughts, or just like your identity, even like who you think you are. Maybe the narrative of who you think you are. So, for instance, you're kind of observing what's happening within you. And as the awareness or the observer, as separate, this act in itself is called metacognition. Because cognition, I guess you could say, is just your inner workings. And meta means beyond. So, beyond. And this is where actually the term metaphysics comes from. So, you've probably heard the term metaphysics. What exactly is metaphysics? Metaphysics is simply beyond the physical. So, it pertains to the unseen. It's beyond, the physical laws of the universe. It's beyond physics. So it pertains to ideas like the esoteric, spirituality, God, even. Because these things, there's no discernible way to prove these things. Or proof. You can't prove these things. But they might very well be real. So essentially, metacognition is the awareness of your inner world, your inner landscape, right? But so it's really good, right? It's good for being separate from your thoughts. From your thoughts. It's separate from your thoughts. It's separate from your suffering. You're witnessing your suffering essentially. You're seeing the inner world with not while being attached. And this can be good for suffering because most of the time when we suffer in our mind, it's because we are attached to these thoughts. we might very well just simply be sitting in our room, sitting in the living room, or just doing our day-to-day tasks, but your mind is elsewhere, and you're like, oh, you're so worried about this, you're so worried about that, and it causes a lot of pain. You know, Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." As Marcus Aurelius once said, "We dye our soul with the color of our thoughts." So it's important to be metacognitive of what's going on within, because what's going on within can usually cause a lot of suffering, and then it distorts what's without based on our perception. But one thing is that there's actually cons to metacognition, and I'd like to think of metacognition as a double-edged sword, right? Because whilst it is good for slashing through your suffering, you're able to like disidentify your thoughts, and you see your thought as thought and your emotion as emotion. But there's this concept which I want to call recursive metacognition. And recursive metacognition is simply the act of observing your thinking, but observing the fact that you're thinking about your thinking in an endless loop. So let's say you're the observer, right? This is you. You're the I here. You're the observer. This is your quote unquote true self, pure awareness, the witness of your thoughts. And let's say you're observing what's happening in your mind. But the truth is, you can also observe the very fact that you're the observer or awareness. And you're probably observing this exact situation. And you can go recursively. You can think about your thinking, about your thinking, about your thinking, about your thinking. And this can lead to something I'd like to call over-analysis, where you think too much, and then, you never reach a conclusion about what's true, or you never settle down because you're constantly analyzing your thinking. So, for instance, you think a bad thought, a negative thought, and then, you're observing this negative thought using metacognition. Oh, I'm simply thinking a bad thought. I'm simply just thinking a bad thought. But then there's like this third level where you're metacognitive about your metacognition, and you're seeing that you're simply thinking. But then you wonder to yourself, perhaps you could wonder to yourself, what if the negative thought is true, even though I can see it, for instance? And then you're thinking to yourself, okay, can I really trust myself? What am I actually thinking about? And yeah, this is just over analysis. Like, metacognition is good to separate from your thoughts. So you could argue that at the very first level, which is this level, where you kind of just detach from your negative thoughts, you were doing quite well for yourself. Let's say you were detached, you were recognizing thought as thought, you were not attached. But then metacognition comes in again, and you start wondering, holy crap, I'm thinking more. What if those thoughts were true? What if, and so on, like just an endless amount of what ifs, basically. And then you're watching all of this. The observer is watching all this happen. So we can see how metacognition is good from detaching from our thoughts. But then you're constantly over-analyzing your thinking. And honestly, it's a double-edged sword. So Let's just draw a nice sword here. A katana or something. That this will do. But essentially, on one side, you're detached. Let's actually use a thicker line. So on one side, you're detached from your thoughts, and it it eases your suffering because you're so detached from your thoughts, and you're like, oh yeah, they're just thoughts. I shouldn't worry too much. But then on the other end, you're thinking about your detachment. You're like thinking about thinking about your thinking. So third level. Right, you're thinking about your thinking about your thinking. And then you're wondering, okay, what's true? But what if I told you the very act of wielding a sword, the very act of, I suppose, needing metacognition, the very act of wielding a sword as if there's something to fight, as if there's negative thoughts to conquer, as if there's a particular degree of separation you need from your thoughts. Uh, what if that causes the suffering? What if the very fact that you're being metacognitive again and again is causing your suffering? Is causing your suffering. And I think this is where kind of Zen philosophy comes in. If you've ever heard of Wu Wei, which is effortlessness, letting go, letting things happen. Why be metacognitive constantly and just constantly holding this katana and sword when you're fighting, when you could simply let go? Think about it. Or rather, don't think about it and just let go. So, in essence, what I kind of want you to take away from this video is that metacognition is a double-edged sword. It can flash through your suffering, but if you're not careful, it can also cut yourself. You can accidentally cut yourself with it. And the essence is just not doing more than what you have to, essentially. It's letting go, letting things happen. Let your thoughts come by. Realize that you're not your thoughts. And just simply be. You don't need to overanalyze. Oh, is this true? Is this true? Is this true? Honestly, I think a lot of our suffering is just attributed to overthinking. It might seem productive to be questioning everything, but I feel like if you keep questioning things, that leads to a particular degree of mental exhaustion. And, self awareness is good, but what if being too self aware is just, getting rid of your desire to live a good life? Or maybe it's preventing you from being happy because you're constantly overanalyzing and you're assuming the identity of someone who needs to think a lot or needs to fight against their thoughts. But what if you could just let go? Simply realize you're not your thoughts. Simply see your thoughts, and you don't have to be constantly detached from them. The goal is to get rid of suffering, or not to get rid of suffering, because I guess suffering will always arise, but the essence is to just recognize your thoughts and, you know, a healthy degree of detachment from your thoughts and being in the here and now without thinking too much about your thoughts. And yeah, the essence is just to simply let go, simply let your thoughts happen, observe them, be separate from them. Don't think too much about your thinking. Sometimes, like thinking in general, like this whole thing could just be thinking in general. And maybe this constant argument is just like causing pain and suffering, but you could just watch it happen, watch it unfold, and yeah, it is what it is,